This is the Texas Land Guys podcast, hosted by brothers Tim Dosch and Tom Dosch. With their partners David Marshall and Trip Rich, they have built DMRE, the leading land brokerage in Texas. With decades of experience brokering deals between landowners and real estate developers, they take you inside the deals that move the market.
Today on the podcast, I've got Tim and David in the Houston office. We're going to be talking about pursuing development opportunities in our two different markets, DFW and Houston MSA. So I think it'll be a good and interesting conversation. How are you guys doing today?
We're doing good, doing real good. Good to have David here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, guys. I got my hair cut and everything for the show today, so
David's
hopefully I look
good.
hopefully I look presentable.
You look good, David. You're wearing that kind of bright pink shirt, so you really pop off the screen. It looks great.
Spring is here.
If you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, we do film these. So if you're just listening to these podcasts on Apple or Spotify, if you want to see what version of polo we're wearing, go ahead and log into the YouTube and check it out. We're in the middle of summer now, so we've kind of had to ditch the weighted vests and the pullovers and all of that.
Yeah. You'll definitely get the latest fashions and trends. So it's good to tune in.
It's funny I made that comment about now we're in summer, so we're wearing polos, but it's been freezing in the office up here. And I think it's got to be tough to be in the HVAC business with these office buildings, because in the winter it's really warm in the office, and then in the summer it's just like freezing cold. So it's got to be tough.
It's getting really hot here in Houston, so I don't mind the cold.
I keep a fleece in my office on the back of my chair just for that reason. It is very cold, and I feel like Mr. Rogers when I have to put it on in the middle of the summer in my office when it's 100 degrees outside.
Yeah, totally. Well, I had taken mine home, and so the other day I brought it back to the office just so I've got something if I need to throw it on when it's blowing. But we thought for today it would be interesting to talk about a topic that comes up a lot when I'm here in Dallas and mentioning and asking groups, are they looking at Houston and looking at development opportunities in Houston? And it's interesting because Dallas and Houston are both such huge markets, two of the largest in the country. Yet a lot of developers don't have Houston on their radar or target to go develop. And I would say the two reasons that we hear a lot are they're concerned about over energy exposure in Houston. I think that's actually kind of been debunked at this point, but that would be its own topic. And then the second is they're concerned about no zoning. And they feel like because there's a lack of zoning in Houston, then there's, can just be so much supply that can hit the market in all these different locations. So we thought today we should discuss maybe more of the zoning aspect of how that impacts both of the markets that we're in.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, from our perspective, I never really worked in a market with zoning. I mean, Houston in general doesn't have zoning, but we do have some small municipalities and cities that do have zoning outside the outskirts of Houston, but we've never really experienced a market where that's an issue. And then obviously, Tom, you learned the business here, worked here for a long time, and then went to Dallas. And Dallas, zoning's a big part of Dallas, so it's something you're very involved in. As we've expanded other markets, we've always had to deal with zoning. So it's kind of interesting. It's not something we have as much experience with here in Houston.
How often are you meeting with developers in Houston that are maybe newer to Houston and they're asking about the lack of zoning, or does it not really come up?
Anybody who's new to Texas and new to Houston will ask about it and try and understand it. I think a lot of the guys we work with, whether they're Houston based or not, have some experience, and so they understand it. I think the biggest challenge is not even necessarily that there's not zoning in particular, but what it does to the city. Because the city develops differently without zoning. Like up in Dallas, you guys have very defined areas that are really good, and then probably areas that aren't as good. And it's a little bit easier to figure out where you should go. Houston's really unique because we have all these different submarkets. Sometimes just going across the street can mean that values drop in half, or rents are way less, or it's not as desirable. And then the submarkets that are in favor that do well tend to shift every couple of years. So you could have a really good submarket like Midtown, kind of back in the 2010 timeframe was really hot. We saw pricing go up probably 4x, from the 2000 to 2010 timeframe to the 2010 to 2020 timeframe. And now it's just not a desirable area. It's not doing well at all. And so that makes Houston really complicated. And the fact that you can drive around and have all kinds of different uses coexisting together, I think can really surprise people. And maybe in some cases, it could be a bigger issue for equity, because you're trying to come to town, trying to put together a story and figure out, why should we do this deal, or why should we maybe, move on from a deal. It's very nuanced here.
Yeah, it's definitely a head scratcher for developers who are new to the market, especially coming from outside of Texas, from another market, because it's so common. Most markets do have zoning, and they have a hard time wrapping their arms around it. And I think Tim brings up a good point. It's not just the developers, it's the equity as well. But for instance, the Heights is one of the best submarkets in the inner loop area in Houston. But you drive up and down, Shepherd or Yale or one of the better streets, north-south streets, and you'll have a brand new retail, multifamily development next to a hubcap store, an auto body shop, just a use type that they do not go together. And that is a huge head scratcher for these developers who are new to the market, who don't understand it. And also they're potential equity partners. And that's why we see a lot of times, I think there's multiple reasons, but one of the reasons a lot of these developers gravitate towards the master plan communities, because it is a master plan developers coming in, creating their own community, their own development, and they're bringing zoning with it in forms of land use restrictions. And developers like that because they know, all right, if I buy a site within this development, I know I'm going to be either one or two of the only developers building this use type. Whereas when you get into the city of Houston where there's not zoning, you could buy a site, build an apartment complex or a retail center, a hotel. And if there's land next door or right down the street, you could see a similar type product pop up, within months or years of you building your property.
Mm-hmm. So let's maybe go into that a little bit more, because that's probably one of the big concerns that I'll hear is if there's not zoning, then there's no governor on supply. There's going to be a lot of supply. But I think that you guys know from working in the market that it's not really like that. It doesn't really just happen that like an area like the Heights becomes in favor, and so suddenly every site in the Heights gets developed into multifamily. So do you want to just maybe hit some of the reasons why that's the case, and not just every site suddenly becomes an apartment tract?
Yeah, there's probably several reasons for that, and it might depend on the market, the submarket we're talking about. For sure, in the infill market, one of the biggest challenges is pricing. Everybody tends to, because you could technically build a high rise or some really high end use on every site, a lot of these sellers will take the highest comp in the submarket or even in the infill market and then assign that to their site. And so we see really high pricing, like David mentioned, the Heights. A lot of these areas, they price the land above what a developer can pay. And then you also have a lot of fragmented sites in the infill market. So maybe you have, or not necessarily fragmented sites, but fragmented markets where you have really small sites. You have to go assemble like 8 different owners to get a big enough site to go do like a wrap deal or some sort of multifamily deal. Typically, multifamily is the highest paying use in the infill market. But if you want to build a wrap deal, you need 4 acres. Like on Shepherd or Yale, it may be hard to get 2 acres, and that might be 3 different owners or 4 different owners. So that has a limitation on supply. And then I think in the suburbs, there are certain pockets where you can get a lot of supply at once. But the better markets, it's still hard to find sites. Pricing is still high. And then utilities tend to be a big problem in Houston. Like the northwest part of town right now is a really hot part of town. We're seeing a lot of developer interest. And it's surprising how a lot of these like major streets and desirable areas, there's not utilities. Or maybe there's some utilities, but there's not enough capacity for multifamily, or the tax rates are really high. That's another problem in Houston, the suburbs. You may have a $3.50 to $4 all-in tax rate, that doesn't really work for multifamily in desirable areas. So I don't know what you'd add to that, David, but there's definitely things that kind of can limit how quickly supply can be added.
Yeah, I think you answered it pretty well there. The inner loop, it's pricing and having a big enough site to develop what you want. But we are seeing developers get creative, like out in the suburbs, for instance. Typically, at least on the apartment side, a suburban apartment developer is not going to build on anything smaller than 10 acres. But we have started to see developers get creative and go smaller than that and build, on 7, 8 acres. And I'm not talking structured parking. It's still surface parked, but they might be 4 stories instead of 3 stories. So they are starting to get more creative on the type of product they can build on the size of the land tract that they're buying.
Maybe a misconception that we have about Dallas, Tom, that we've had and just kind of talked about recently is my perception of Dallas is there's a lot of limitation on supply because of zoning. That there's just this scarcity of sites that are zoned, but it actually sounds like, I know from just historically, Dallas has put up huge numbers for supply and putting deals in the pipeline, and it just seems like there's no shortage of opportunities up there. Do you want to maybe speak to that, kind of coming from a Houston perspective, where we think, well, Dallas must have all these limitations?
Yeah, there's definitely more limitations in Dallas with zoning, but if you just look at the numbers and the amount of deliveries that Dallas has had, same with Austin. Austin is more difficult from a zoning and just general regulation standpoint than Dallas, but there's still incredible amount of development activity. And some of that is just due to demand. There's so much demand that developers are going to figure out what they need to do to get projects developed. But there's certain parts of Dallas, kind of like Houston, where you're not going to get anything done. You're not going to be able to get something zoned. And then there's other parts of town, like right now in the city of Dallas, if you want to go do apartments in the city of Dallas, there's not going to be a whole lot of roadblocks to do that. But if you want to go do apartments in South Lake, West Lake, North Lake, Grapevine, Flower Mound, those areas, it's going to be, almost impossible, if not impossible, to do apartments there. But I would say it's not too dissimilar from, if you guys think about Houston, like Sugar Land. Why is it like areas like Sugar Land, Pasadena, League City, the city of Katy? Some of those have zoning. Some of them just have deed restrictions that they've put in place where it actually makes it really difficult. Like city of Katy doesn't technically have zoning, but they have deed restrictions in place that make it really difficult to develop multifamily. So it's kind of similar in some ways to that, where there's going to be pockets that just because there's zoning doesn't mean they won't zone apartments. And then there's pockets where there's zoning and they're just not going to zone apartments.
Yeah, that's what makes Houston so complicated, and if you're coming from outside of Houston, I think one thing that we like is you need a land broker in Houston who knows the city, because it's just so different. Like you're saying, like League City is a great submarket to develop in, but there's hardly any sites that you can buy. The zoning is insane down there. They don't want apartments. The one deal I know of that did get zoned for apartments still hasn't been built because it doesn't make sense the way it was zoned. And so you have really good fundamentals and just a limit to what you could actually build. And then you have areas like the Northwest where there's really not a limit to what you could build. The market has to limit that, and then to some extent utilities. But we do see that a lot in Houston, where these cities like Richmond-Rosenberg is another example, where they will technically allow apartments, but the way they allow them, there's so many restrictions on them that it really doesn't make market sense to go build there.
Yeah, they'll put something on it like the parking ratio is 4 spaces to 1 unit. When you start talking about that kind of ratio, unless you get the land at a really, inexpensive price, you can't make sense of those numbers. It's going to be interesting, though. I know up in Austin, the state government's talking about, through legislation, talking about how to make, because there is a housing shortage going on in Texas with all the growth we're having, how to make it easier to build and develop in these municipalities that it's difficult to build residential in, whether it's multifamily or whether it's single family lots and the lot sizes. Typically they like the larger lots, but being able to build denser product, and that's kind of been the pushback a lot of times on the single family side is they don't like the smaller lots. They don't want the denser product, and then on the multi side they do want the denser product. They want the structured parking, but it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of Austin and the legislation and them meeting to discuss this on how they can work with the different municipalities across the state and developers to make it easier so we aren't dealing with this housing shortage that we're currently dealing with here in the state.
Yeah, the challenge I think with zoning can be what we'll see in some of these cities up here in Dallas and It's interesting, Tim, because you make the comment about the need for a land broker in Houston. What I didn't know about Dallas until I moved here was we have 180 municipalities that make up DFW. Wow. It's extremely complicated. And a lot of times you'll be working in one really small area and there's like 4 different cities. So that's 4 different city councils, 4 different city staffs. Literally being across the street can have a big bearing on whether or not you can get something approved there. And some of these cities see it as, this is like our one chance to see our city get developed. So we're going to hold all of our land on, whether it's the Tollway or George Bush, and we're not going to allow anything to go there except for like office. And so that's why you'll see these cities where there's no development on their like freeway frontage, because they're just waiting. And then you'll see like the next city up the road that's allowed development. And so that's where there's the Costco and the H-E-B, and that's where there's the development. And so a lot of times it's difficult for landowners because you may buy an incredible property at like a major intersection. You could be off the DNT, but if the city has decided that that's going to be office, it will be an incredible site someday, but it could be like 20 years before it's like they'll do things like minimum 12-story office building, zoning on a lot of these sites. And so that can make it really challenging. And you're talking, David, about just density. I was talking to a client yesterday, and he lives kind of in an affluent area close to the mid-cities. And he was saying they just got a deal. I think he said it did get approved, but it was acre lots, and the city didn't want to approve it because it was too much density on acre lots. And so you'll see that, a lot. We just had a deal fall out of contract for zoning, and it was because the same thing. They wanted, larger than acre lots on the site. The city did. We had a really quality developer builder that builds really high-end homes, but they didn't want to do larger than acre lots. And so it fell out for that reason. And then crazy enough, there was a bald eagle migration going on with the site as well, which I didn't know we had bald eagles up here, but there was a bald eagle migration going on. And so that was a like environmental reason that you can run into sometimes on these deals. But yeah, zoning can definitely have an impact. I mean, can you guys in Houston think of areas that you think have developed out really well despite that? And then maybe areas that are, continue to be challenging, and maybe you wouldn't tie it to the fact that there's no zoning, but, just kind of the juxtaposition of those two.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the master plan communities. They do a really, really good job of that. Now, I know that's not a municipality, but the way they structure it, they have land use restrictions. But if we're talking about municipalities, I would say Sugar Land's done a really good job of having zoning and land use restrictions, and it's turned out really, really well. It's a very desirable place to live. The Woodlands is another area. They've done a really good job with land use restrictions and zoning up there. And I would say those are probably the 2 main ones here in Houston. Tim, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
What I was going to say, because Tom, were you asking about like the benefit of not zoning and how areas have developed in a positive way without zoning?
Yeah. That was more just what makes Houston unique, but where it's actually been a positive.
Yeah, because I think if you look at like the Galleria submarket, it's probably one of the cleanest infill markets where everything's really nice. It actually probably has the worst rents in our market, and is not doing very well. And then the area where we're actually seeing all the momentum and desirability for people where they want to live, where they want to go out, where developers want to be, is the Heights submarket, Washington Avenue, Garden Oaks, Edo, those submarkets that have gentrified from, rougher areas where you had really old houses, kind of shotgun kind of houses that were falling apart, and you had old industrial with razor wire, hubcap stores, manufacturing kind of facilities. But because there's not zoning, those areas are really cool. I mean, they're kind of this cool bohemian, you'll have like really cool restaurants, and you still may have like some old, vestiges of the past there, like some old homes or some old industrial next door. But they're really neat, and they have a lot of character to them. I mean, Edo is really cool. I mean, some of our best restaurants now are in Edo, but Edo is still can feel pretty rough, and certain parts of it can feel rough. But it's interesting as a land brokers, because we go to these areas, and like we're working right now with a mattress factory that has, these old buildings that are, over 100 years old, some of them. And so talking about coming in and making some of that retail, and doing adaptive reuse and using the cool buildings. They have these cool like old skylights and like wood beams and stuff. There's some really neat restaurants and developments that have a lot of character that are kind of built around the old part of the city. And then you'll have, just like a brand new building going up, next to something that just it doesn't seem like it really fits, but it makes it really interesting. And so I think, we appreciate that in Houston quite a bit. I actually think maybe that's better sometimes than everything just being kind of perfect. It's because even when you go to like New York or Manhattan, some of these places, there's still a lot of character. Having the old and the new next to each other, it's kind of neat. And obviously, Houston doesn't look that much like that, but you still see like there's a lot more interesting parts of the city when you do it that way.
Yeah, a friend of mine that is from California that lives up here in DFW now is telling me he was in Houston last weekend, and he's blown away with just how much character Houston has, the different neighborhoods. He was commenting on the different neighborhoods like the Heights, and then he had spent some time down in West U, and then he spent some time down. He went to a couple of the baseball games, so he spent some time down in like Edo and downtown, and he felt like just the character that Houston had was really unique, and he hadn't seen that in anywhere else in Texas. He had just been in Austin, and then he's lived in the DFW market for a while. And I think in a similar vein, we were talking to a client earlier this week that said he's a multifamily developer. He looks for multifamily development sites that are walkable, and he would rather be in an edgier area, exactly what you're describing, Tim, than in like an area that is, kind of like a State Farm campus, like all brand new office buildings, all brand new retail and brand new apartments. And because he said he thinks that the resident actually wants to live in more of that like unique environment where there's like a cool old coffee shop or like an old bookstore or, just something that's not just completely like whitewashed, which I thought was really an interesting observation. And when you think about even just what you said about the difference in rents between an area like the Galleria and an area like, maybe the Heights, it's a very different living experience for the resident.
Yeah. Well, I think as you're saying that, what I was thinking is the target for all these developments are younger people, so specifically multifamily, they're the ones that drive, the higher end land sales and the higher end rents in the infill market. And they're targeting, everything from out of college to probably like early 30s, single or newly married younger people. They want to be around the cool bars and restaurants. They like kind of an exciting area like that, an area that's transitioning where there's a lot of vibrance in life. And then typically I think people maybe get married, have kids, and they move to the suburbs, and then they want the opposite. They go to the master plan community that Dave was talking about, where everything is, sidewalks and, their kids can play safely and there's Little League and all that. And so I think it's important to remember, like, the group that's driving all this economic growth a lot of times is a younger demographic, and this kind of appeals to them. And I think if it was and that's why the Galleria, I think, has suffered, because the Galleria just it's not exciting. Everything it's too nice, it's too institutional feeling. There's not as much character to it. And so they don't tend to gravitate to it.
And then you have a segment of the older demographic too. Like Tim said, they move out to the suburbs, they raise their family, their kids go off to college. There's that segment of that older demographic that wants to move back to that kind of cooler, hipper area that we're talking about. So we've had some friends recently who've, raised their kids went off to college, they're empty nesters now. They moved to the Heights because they wanted to be near the restaurants and kind of more that not necessarily nightlife, but that hipper, trendier stuff that, maybe they experienced when they were, in that 22 to 35 age range.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's really interesting. I think we see, like, in the Heights, there's a lot of older demographic. You have like the young demographic and the old demographic, and the older demographic tends to buy the townhomes, and then they're living, next to the younger demographic who are in the apartments. And that's why a lot of these restaurants are doing so well, because you have a lot of disposable income, and people want to go out and enjoy the city.
So if I'm a developer and I want to come develop in Houston, and the concern was kind of what we're talking about, like there's a lack of zoning. I'm really concerned about supply or being in an area that could really deteriorate because of a lack of zoning for some reason. So walk me through, like, where would be maybe like 2 or 3 submarkets that you would say these would be great places to start? And let's just assume that I'm open to, suburban and urban, so it doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we do a lot of times is track where rents are, and so that's a pretty good barometer. And I'm really speaking of multifamily here because a lot of our, these conversations are multifamily driven. Now we also are having industrial conversations, which is a totally different, kind of set of data points we're looking at, and then also on the single family for sale side. But if we just want to focus on multifamily, we're looking at rents. And so in the infill market, where can you get the highest rents? And then where's a good entry point where you can develop, get a large enough site to develop a wrap product, or even high density surface park that's kind of on the fringe of the infill market, but can still get good rents. And that's, Edo, Garden Oaks, the Heights, Spring Branch, kind of going out I-10 to City Center and Brittmore. That pocket is a really good infill pocket. Some of the other areas, like you mentioned, West U, which is an unbelievable area, it's just really hard to find sites. I mean, if there is anything, it's going to be $300 a foot or $400 a foot, and you're talking high-rise pricing. There just really aren't sites. And then the same thing like Kirby, Greenway, Montrose, very desirable areas, but probably $200 to $300 a foot to buy a site, and so it's high-rise again. So we're not seeing as much of that, even though we have done some of those deals in the last 2 years, just because they're so desirable. They're just much tougher. So I do think there's pretty strong barriers to entry in the infill market, mainly because the pricing is it's so hard to find a good site at a price that actually makes sense. What would you say about the suburban market, David?
Yeah, on the suburban side, I would say probably that pie-shaped piece, going along I-10 west and 290 or maybe even 249 north. So essentially the northwest quadrant, west and northwest quadrant, I would say are probably the two areas where I would direct developers to the most, at least from a multifamily standpoint. I think that's probably where we're seeing the most growth is west and northwest. So Waller County, out in the Katy Prairie, but you run into issues out there, that we talked about earlier. Does the site you want to buy have utilities? What's the tax rate? So you got to be sensitive, or developers are sensitive to those kind of things. But from a suburban focus, that's where I would direct developers.
And we can talk to people on, on a submarket by submarket basis. When you look at supply, there's going to be different barriers to entry. So in some suburban submarkets, it's going to be, hey, if we can get utilities, it's going to be really hard for someone to get utilities very close to the site. Or, for example, 290 inside the Ground Parkway, it's so developed out that finding a site, there just aren't really sites that are left. Or it would be very difficult you may have to go get some subdivided sites and bring them together and be very creative to get a site that could be competition. So it kind of is a submarket by submarket discussion. But also, a lot of developers in Houston are building workforce product. And so they're looking at where can I go get land that's at a good price. There's good submarket rents, but they're going to be in and out in a couple of years. And so they're not as much looking at how is this going to age, what's this going to be like in 10 years or 15 years, which I think is a big question in some parts of Houston. How well are some of these suburban areas going to do long term? And then you have, really strong core sites like in Katy or maybe League City, to some extent in Cypress by Bridgelands. There are some sites where like these are going to be the really good sites long term. They could be, anywhere from $20 to $30 a foot. They're high density surface park, A+ kind of sites. There's just not that many of them in Houston. They're hard to find. And there's a lot of developers that really aren't even looking for that kind of product. We have a couple that are willing to do those deals and willing to pay up for them, but a lot of developers are looking for the, just kind of path of growth, basis kind of plays, workforce kind of plays, and maybe not even as concerned about supply, because they're just going to go build it at a certain basis and be out in a couple of years and not as concerned about that.
I know here a lot of times developers will bring like a map of the city and then they'll circle different areas that they really want to be in. And you know how that is. A lot of times it's like all the areas that get circled are areas that it's like, circle Rice University, to your point, Tim. Like, so there's the areas that if you just went and looked at the demographics and the rents, it would be, that's where I want to be. But then, we can very quickly tell them, the way that we look at markets and the way we do research is we have talked to that city, we've called on every site, and we can tell you that I never want to say it's impossible or that this is the last site, because I've learned in the business, you're never selling the last site anywhere. That's definitely a broker word. But at the same time, there's areas where it's probably just not worth going and beating your head against the wall, because you may get shut down. There may not be a site for like 10 years that actually pencils, gets through the zoning, whatever it is. But I can imagine that if you guys were meeting with a developer from out of town, they're going to circle an area like Sugar Land. They're going to circle an area like the Woodlands. They're probably going to circle the Bridgelands. They're probably going to circle somewhere down south, like, Pearland or League City, something like that. So of those areas, do you feel like there's any of those areas that it's worth the effort to either go try to zone something or find something? Or is it just in Houston because you run, like an area like Sugar Land, it could get done, but we're only seeing maybe like one deal a decade get done in a market like Sugar Land?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, what I would say to that is like areas like Sugar Land, it's a major uphill battle to get something rezoned. But what we would do is show, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll direct developers, hey, we can go just outside of Sugar Land, adjacent. And you might not be in the city, but you get the benefits of being adjacent to it and close to it. We saw a lot of that happen up in the Woodlands area where you couldn't get into the Woodlands proper, but we saw a ton of development just south of Woodlands proper, along the Grand Parkway, going north to the southern boundary of Woodlands. And while they're not in the actual city, they're adjacent to and get up most of the benefits from being next to it.
Yeah, that's what's almost most surprising to me about Houston is, you think about Dallas and all these developers are having to go rezone sites, and it's just part of the business. It's something they're used to. It's weird in Houston, no one even really tries. I mean, not that people don't. I mean, we've had people try in Sugar Land and, try in different markets, but you would think as strong as some of these markets are, there'd be more groups trying. And, every year you'd have multiple groups tying up sites and going to Sugar Land or League City or Clear Lake or these different cities and trying to, pitch them on getting some zoning and building some deals. And we don't really see that. It's actually pretty rare. And like David said, everybody just goes the path of least resistance. If I can go do a deal in Houston and not go through zoning and try and still have a good story of being a good area, I'm just going to go do that. I think it's because they know it could be a multi-year battle in some of these towns. And at the end of the day, maybe you don't get it. But I think that's it's almost a little bit surprising. We just don't even think about trying in some of these markets because of how difficult they are.
But a lot of times what's happened is you'll have master plan community developers go into these different municipalities and they're developing thousands of acres. So the city gives them entitlements for 1,500 apartment units or 2,000 apartment units and 500 single family for rent units. So they've given them the entitlements for that. And now that's because they're developing 4,000 acres and bringing a ton of taxable value and taxable base to the city. But, they're giving them a big chunk. So after that, they'll probably shut things down for a long period of time. And we've seen that happen down in the League City, down in Missouri City, Sugar Land, not so much, but a lot of times that's what happens, and that's why they tap the brakes and won't allow rezoning.
It seems like an implication, as you guys are talking, that I have heard as well about Houston is because the lack of zoning, to your both of your points about path of least resistance, developers could maybe get out of the ground a lot quicker. And I wonder if you guys believe that's true, because one fear is maybe Houston's down from a supply standpoint, but as soon as the lights go back on, we're going to have, you name it, 20,000 units just get announced overnight. But I don't know if that's completely true. And so I'm interested what you guys think about that. And I can speak to it from a Dallas standpoint too, but go ahead.
I think when you have the desirable submarkets, so let's just talk, I think where that would happen is the suburbs. I don't think there's any way it happens in the infill market unless we see really strong equity, where they're going to go pay $200 a foot for sites. Because the problem in the infill market is to do a lot of deals, you're going to run up against sellers who are very patient, they're very long term, and they just want these huge numbers that the market doesn't support. So I think actually if you can go do an infill deal, there's really high barriers to entry, and I think we're huge believers in that. I know it's tough right now, but mean, if I'm investing in multifamily, I'm doing the infill market in Houston. I think the suburbs is where you're going to see, more supply. And again, it depends on the submarket. There's actually not that many submarkets where you could do a ton of deals because the really desirable submarkets already have a lot of, they're built out. So there's deals existing. There's other use types. So there's just not a lot of large enough sites to go do deals. And then a lot of these areas where you're seeing, new development, new growth, there may not be utility capacity. So you might see a lot of land in different fields and stuff and think, well, why, couldn't you build all this supply? And the reality is it's going to be hard to get utility capacity. And sometimes that can take years to develop out. So you could narrow down, and that's where I think we can help our clients start to narrow down, like, where would I be vulnerable to a lot of supply? And where is there some kind of built-in barriers to entry? And then I think one good thing about Houston is the market does tend to regulate supply, pretty well. There have been times where things got frothy here, and we probably got a little bit overbuilt. But Houston tends to pull back. I think we're not a market as much like Austin was or Dallas, where there's so much confidence in the market that people just go crazy and overbuild it. It seems like a number of deals get announced, and then the developers and equity tend to kind of pull back a little bit and try and let that get absorbed. So that's why I think we've been kind of more of a stable market. So I don't know if that answers your question, Tom, but
I think it does. And I think from the standpoint of just looking at Dallas, and if you were to say lights go back on, you can have a lot of supply in Houston overnight. We definitely have seen a lot of supply in Dallas. I mean, there's submarkets. Well, what I normally tell developers is if you're concerned about supply, you're not going to find a site in Dallas that doesn't have a lot of supply around it. That's just the reality.
Yeah.
Now, that's kind of changing because of the market we've been in. But like today, if you go look at construction and deals, starting lease up, and you go to any market like a Denton or McKinney or Salina or Anna or even, a Plano or Frisco, there's still just a lot proposed and a lot under construction. And some of it is because, very similar to what you said, David, the way these cities will put out zoning in the suburban areas is they'll just zone thousands of units as part of their planning. And so you may not be able to get utilities to all of those sites today, and maybe they're greenfield sites today. But in some cases, they're not. Like, you could argue that there's maybe 3,000 units in a submarket that are all zoned, that if rents increased to where it made sense, you could have developers go put all those sites under contract. And it seems like with the way the Houston market is, to your point, Tim, you'd have to have rents really increase in the urban market for developers to start paying those numbers. But then what would happen at the exact same time is the guy that wanted 200 will want 250.
Yeah.
And then the guy that wanted 250 will want 300. And unless rents just keep growing, at some point, pretty quickly, the developers will have to back off and say, well, we can't pay 250 for that. And to your point, the perfect 2-acre site, the guy was able to pay 220 for, doesn't mean you can pay 220 for the 5-acre site, a mile away, but that's what that owner might want. And so it kind of self-regulates because it's like the perfect demand and supply system when you have no zoning, because there's demand, but then there's supply that automatically gets restricted with these owners based on what they think their properties are worth.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I think it's
that's a great point.
It's an interesting conversation because we definitely hear that a lot. And I'm seeing more and more of our developers up here wanting to go down to Houston right now, just because Austin, there's been a lot of supply delivered. There's been a lot of supply delivered here in Dallas. And Houston, really, with how large the market is, it's pretty incredible the lack of supply that Houston's had compared to these other Texas markets. So there's a lot more opportunity. And I think we're seeing more and more developers wanting to go down there. But it sounds like, at least today, it's still a lot more workforce basis driven, probably Carlisle type driven capital that's going down there.
Yeah, I would say probably, what do you think, David, 90% of our suburban product is workforce. We're actually doing, I want to say like a lot, but we're doing a handful of really high end, kind of like I say, Class A plus, really good sites, deals right now in some of the hard to get into markets. We've just been very fortunate to find some really good sites that we're really excited about and, put some great developer clients on them. So, but I think for the most part, it's just a lot of this workforce product. And in the infill market, we are seeing some activity, but, it's really tough right now, as you know, Tom, to get those deals to pencil. I think we'll probably see most of the new supply in the infill market is still going to be in the Heights area, maybe Garden Oaks, because that just tends to be where the renters want to live, and where you can get deals capitalized and still build a lower density of product, a wrap product, that makes more sense.
The strategy also is different, from suburban development to infill development. Most of the suburban development on the multifamily front, they're merchant builders. They're going to build it, they're going to lease it up, they're going to sell it. That does happen in the inner loop areas as well, for sure, but not at the same volume that you see it, and from a percentage standpoint that you see it in the suburbs. It's a lot lower percentage in the inner loop area. In the inner loop area, a lot of times you've got the strategy is a longer term hold, whereas the suburbs, I would say the majority of the time, it's a merchant build strategy.
Would you say, Tom, that there's any you asked us a question about Houston and, are there some benefits of the lack of zoning in some of these areas, how they develop? Would you say that in Dallas, especially having so much experience in Houston and going to Dallas and doing a lot up there, what are the benefits of zoning that you've seen in Dallas? And maybe it depends on the different submarkets, because in some cases maybe it's not being done well, and some cases it is being done well. But are there things you appreciate about the zoning up there?
Yeah, I think so for sure. I mean, I think that if you drive around in Dallas and a lot of the northern areas, like along the Tollway and Plano and Frisco and, Prosper, it's pretty incredible just how clean and how nice the development is. And it's not to say there's not parts of Houston that are like that as well, but I think in Dallas, it probably loses a little bit of the character like we talked about, but there's just so many areas that are so nice. They're so institutional feeling. You have just really significant large developments. They've definitely done a good job in DFW of having these employment nodes, which I would say that Houston has as well with, the Energy Corridor and the West Chase Business District and Greenway Plaza and Galleria. I mean, Houston's done the same thing without zoning, by developing out these business districts. But I think that's probably the biggest difference was when we moved up here and you start just driving around. It's incredible how clean a lot of the areas are, and just the master planning it all comes down to, like you said, David, it's the master plan developer and the master plan community. Well, in a place like DFW with 180 municipalities, it's the city. So did the city do a good job of master planning? Some cities do a better job than others. So you're not going to necessarily have like a one continuous feel as you drive across the market with so many different cities with different motivations. Some of them have less, commercial taxable value, and some of them have more single family taxable value. So it's just going to depend. But I definitely think that when we're thinking about advising clients on where to look, there's a lot of markets where I advise them not to go try to rezone. And there's a reason that there's great tracts that just remain undeveloped, and unless you're in a lot of these markets, unless you're a entertainment use or some kind of like maybe a corporate use, some office use, those sites are not going to be developed until those uses come. And it seems like that's what all these cities really want. These difficult cities is they want like an office development with an actual tenant, or they want a, some kind of big entertainment use. And that
town center type development.
Yeah. And that's challenging because, we're mostly working with developers, and a lot of the development we're working on is spec, apartments you're just building, single family you're just building, and then industrial, most of what we're working on is spec. So it can make it, really difficult. And so you'll see cities just get skipped from a development standpoint if that's kind of the position that they're taking.
Yeah, and then you have the ETJ play up there as well, where you have cities where are super restrictive, or they're not going to let you build apartments, but you can get in the ETJ and get utilities and build a deal. And so it seems like there's a lot of activity up there with that, developers pursuing those kind of sites, right?
Yeah, I think that's been an area that, we've really tried to focus on, just because you take out the zoning risk on the ETJ sites. But it's, with the type of activity and volume we try to do and just how active we are, those are just really hard to find. It's really hard to find an ETJ site that's like not way out in the middle of nowhere or has utilities, or, doesn't have something wrong with it. But we've definitely been very active on the ones that were actionable And that's been that's kind of made it feel a little bit like Houston, that we've been able to just go do deals on those sites. And we've also taken the approach of, let's go look at the best undeveloped sites. And we've learned the cities that it wasn't worth doing that in, because we've spent time trying to pursue zoning. In some cities we've pursued zoning for all the different use types: industrial, mixed use, single family, multifamily. And if it's difficult on every use type in those cities, you just kind of know, like, they're really not pro-development right now. There's some cities that really just aren't. And what happens that's unique as well in an area like DFW is you have a lot of these city staff that they move around a lot. So we see a lot of people move around in the development business. You see a lot of the city staff move around. So, like, maybe they're the city planner at Rockwall. Well, maybe next year they're going to be the city planner at, like, Anna, or or you move over to Fort Worth. And so sometimes what happens is maybe like a city that was not as pro-growth gets a different city manager or planning department staff turns over, and that can kind of change, or the reverse can happen. And a lot of times what you see is the cities that were more pro-growth, they'll go pick up somebody that's at a city that's maybe more mature, that's really kind of put, more restrictions on growth. And so then it starts to slow down the growth in that city as well. So it can really change. There's a lot of deals we'll work on where if you're trying to pursue a zoning early in the year, election timeframe is key. So it's, a lot of times it's like, we're not going to, let's not do anything until after the elections. And then the elections can really change things. And you have cities where there's a city here in DFW where the mayor's been mayor for over 40 years. So it's like, it's pretty much known how he's, going to kind of direct things. And so you can get, you can get big personalities on council, on staff, and it can be really hard when it comes to rezoning to really know if it's going to be a good use of time or not, and which way it's going to go.
It seems like cities move more restrictive the more mature they get. I mean, would you say that's correct? Because I think even in Houston, the cities that we have where there is zoning, I'm even thinking of places like Fulshire and Conroe and some of these areas where there traditionally were pretty much no barriers, but as they've matured and there's been more and more developer interest, suddenly, like you're saying, you've had a turnover in the city staff, and now they're more restrictive and they're not as pro-development. It just seems like everybody kind of gets on that trajectory, like, the Sugar Land trajectory of getting super restrictive as they mature as a city.
Yeah, and
what they might be doing also is they see the growth that's happening, or the growth that's coming and happening, and they might go out and look for a city planner who's experienced that and who's dealt with that, and try to hire them away from a municipality that's seen a lot of growth and development like that. And that person, to your point, Tom, could come in and be the reason it's as restrictive as it can be.
Yeah, that's right. I think it makes sense. Initially, you're trying to build up your taxable base. You want new schools, you want new roads, you want all these, new city hall, new fire department, all these things for the city services. But then once you start to get all of those, and then you realize depending on the size of the city, that you're starting to run out of raw land because you've been improving everything, then I think they start to pull back. And so we see that a lot. It's like there's just these phases. And yeah, I can't think of one that, has been like really, 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 pro-development and then gone restrictive and then gone back to really, really pro-development. So, or done it the reverse.
Well, it becomes so political. And I think that's the fear that people start having is, making a big change. And especially with multifamily, because multifamily tends to be the negative that groups are, cities are worried about. And so they're worried it won't be executed properly. A lot of times I think those worries might be somewhat unfounded, because the kind of developments that you can do can be really high end and really nice, and have high rents and have a great demographic. But I think cities tend to fear that that's going to hurt the city long term. And I think it's really the residents that tend to pressure people in the city. And you don't want to be the mayor or the person on the city council that let 1,000 units get developed, and everybody's upset at you. So I think the political nature of it is difficult. And it makes a lot of sense, like you're saying, with 180 municipalities for you guys up there in Dallas, needing a good broker to help navigate that. Where are the deals? Where are the opportunities? Where is a good time to spend your time? Because I think whether you're in Houston or Dallas, for us as brokers, we're not going to go work on something that doesn't have a chance of getting done. I mean, we don't waste our time. So we want to find the real deals that can get done, relatively quickly in a market time frame, We're not going to waste time on a site that is going to get, have a very low chance of getting rezoned or have some sort of restriction that can't be overcome. So I think we tend to get really good at figuring out, what are the real hurdles and what can be overcome. And that makes sense up in Dallas. You need someone to be advising you to figure out where do we go focus our time geographically.
Yeah, and these cities have identities, just like people, like they see themselves a certain way. And so a lot of times you'll hear, well, we're not like, and it's the city next door. And they're very competitive. So there's a lot of that, especially these suburban areas that are growing rapidly. A lot of the people, that have lived there for maybe like generations, I think if you lived in a city that was like, now it's 2,000 people, but it's going to be projected to be 20,000 people, like in the next like 3 years, because there's that many homes being built, you feel like something that was like really special, kind of your heritage, it's just completely being changed overnight. And so we'll go and meet with city council and staff, and that's a lot of what you hear is like, well, we don't want to be like the next city over. We have our own identity. And I've heard cities say like, the growth can just skip us. We want to, but I think what's tough is obviously that it's just part of the process of change and growth. Is 50 years ago, that would have been areas that are like close in our cities, and now it's just blown right through them. And the population's grown, and we're fortunate in both of our markets that there's so much land for growth. We have, we have so much land, really without any natural barriers. You guys have the Gulf on one side, but other than that, it can keep growing really west and northwest and north. And so the Grand Parkway in Houston, I can't remember how long that is. I know we talked about that on a different podcast, but it's like the longest.
I should know that, but it's ridiculously long.
It's like, I think Jason Baker had said it was the longest road built in the world or something at the time. Wow. Continuous loop. So, that just enables so much growth, which is incredible. And that's why our cities are projected to be two of the largest in the country. And so it's interesting. They're going to be two of the largest in the country. One of them has zoning and one of them doesn't. At the end of the day, you kind of wonder how much it really matters, which is, I think, why this is a pretty interesting conversation.
Well, I think a big point to realize is growth is going to find a way. It's kind of like water. Water is going to spread out and it's going to permeate whatever it can. It's going to flow around obstacles. And I think growth is the same way. It's going to, when you have all these people coming, they have to live somewhere. Everybody can't live. And, a lot of these cities, they want, these larger lots and these super expensive homes. Everybody can't afford a home like that, And so the more you try and make your city a non-market environment, the growth is going to go somewhere else because it has to find a place where it makes sense from a market standpoint, where people can afford to live there, and people have to have a place to live. So it'll be interesting to see how both cities grow. And I don't think Houston's going to change anytime soon. I don't think we're going to adopt zoning.
Yeah, I don't see that happening.
We will have it in certain places, but we're not going to have it, in the majority of areas. And so it'll just be interesting to see, over the next 20 years, kind of how both cities grow.
Yeah, that's something interesting. I've never looked into it. I probably should. The history of why Houston went the way they went when it was not the norm. Mm-hmm. The norm's to have zoning, but they did not adopt zoning, and they haven't adopted zoning ever since the city was formed. So it'd be interesting to know the history behind that and, why they went that route versus the zoning route.
Yeah. Well, I think I like that quote, Tim, maybe to finish out the episode, that growth is like water. But I think we're fortunate that we're, both in markets that we have land to grow, infrastructure to grow. We have a business environment of growth. And so they're fun markets to be in. But yeah, this was a good conversation. I'm sure we'll have others around zoning, and I'm interested to hear conversations that continue to come up around this, just as more and more of these developers, I think, will be focused on Houston in this cycle.
Yeah, maybe just a quick plug to talk to our teams. If you're a developer looking at either one of these markets, we've done hundreds of transactions in these markets and, looked at these areas develop over, decades now, especially in Houston, and seen, all kinds of things happen. And so I think we can really add a lot of value just talking through different areas, talking through different product types, where we're seeing areas transition, where we think the opportunities are, areas maybe to stay away from. So I think it's time well spent to sit down and talk to our team and just kind of go through the market.
Good, guys. Well, thanks for being on today. This was fun. Thanks, David, for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
It's great. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have questions about land you own in Texas, send us an email at texaslandguys@dmre.com and follow us on LinkedIn to stay updated.